1,000 years ago, people lived very simply. Today, there are still people living in the north of Scotland in much the same way. Most of them lived in small cottages in scattered hamlets and villages. Nearly everything they needed had to come from the land around them. There was hardly any buying and selling. The building materials and fuel, food and tools they produced only satisfied the needs of a household or at most a village. There was very little over for trade. They kept sheep to give them enough wool to make clothes for themselves. Sheep have always done well in England because the climate is the kind that keeps pasture green all the year round. In many parts of the country, there is limestone or chalk under the soil, and a grass grows there on which sheep thrive. Because of this good soil and climate, English sheep grew the best wool in Europe. From very early times, foreign cloth makers valued English wool for its fine texture and length. By the 11th century, English sheep owners had found that if they produced more wool than they could use themselves, they could sell it to cloth makers abroad. The most important centres of cloth making in the early Middle Ages were Flanders and northern Italy. These two areas lay at the centre of all the main trade routes. As trade grew, more and more merchants came from these centres to buy England's wool. By the 13th century, nearly everybody was growing wool to sell abroad, even the humblest peasants. But the people who could raise the largest flocks were the big landowners. Monasteries, like Fountains Abbey, were among the biggest landowners in the Middle Ages. And the monks were among the first people to keep large numbers of sheep. But nobles, great and small, on their estates did the same. And often the combined flocks of the villagers were even larger than those of the nobles and monks. This map will show how the quality of wool varied from county to county in the 14th century. The best quality long wool for worsted cloth came from the Lindsey area of Lincolnshire. Quite good wool of this kind came from the rest of Lincolnshire, the East Midlands and the Cotswolds. The best quality short wool for woolens and broadcloths came from the Welsh border. Quite good wool of this sort came from the West Midlands, the Mendips and the Chilterns. Nearly all the other counties produced wool of some kind that could be sold abroad. Cornwall was probably the only county that produced really poor quality wool, and it was referred to as Cornish hair. After the wool was sheared, it was packed in sacks, sealed with the merchant's mark, like this one, carved on Tiverton Church. It was then shipped abroad in sailing ships to the cloth makers of Flanders and northern Italy. In those days, wool was exported from many ports now little used: King's Lynn, Sandwich, Hythe, and Boston, as well as from ports that are still famous today, such as London, Southampton, and Bristol. And into the warehouses of these ports poured the goods that paid for our wool: wine and oil, resin and pitch, cloth and spices, timber, iron, and copper. The trade in wool grew so much that taxing it was a good way for the king to add to his income. To make collection of the taxes easy, all the wool going abroad either went to one port on the continent where it was taxed, or it was collected in certain towns in England to be taxed. Such a town was Lincoln. And from each town it was sent to the nearest port to be shipped abroad. Eventually, at the close of the 14th century, one port on the continent was chosen. This was Calais, then a British possession, and through it passed nearly all the wool exported from England until the end of the 15th century. Here the taxes were collected before the wool was distributed to the centres where the cloth was made. The port was called the staple port, and the small body of merchants that handled the trade were called the merchants of the staple, or staplers. These merchant staplers grew rich and spent much of their money in the towns where they lived. The effect this had on the face of England is seen by the buildings that still stand. Chipping Camden Church was built by wealthy wool merchants. William Greville, whose effigy is carved on the church, was one of them. On his tomb inside, it says that he was known as the flower of all the wool merchants of England. Greville built a fine house for himself in the town. It has a doorway wide enough for a pack horse loaded with bales of wool. Wool halls were built in nearly all the towns which were centres of the wool trade. Here the growers gathered and the merchants came to buy their wool. Later, the number of growers increased so much that travelling merchants could make a profit by buying the wool from the growers in the outlying districts, bringing it into the towns, and selling it to the merchant staplers. These travelling merchants were called woolmen. Northleach, near Camden, was one of the places where this trading between merchant staplers and woolmen went on. The woolmen grew rich like the staplers, and often they too spent their wealth on fine buildings. The brasses on their tombs show that they were proud of the source of their wealth. For they are shown with their feet on wool sacks and on sheep. Small and simple churches no longer suited the taste of the churchmen, nobles, and merchants. With the wealth that came from wool, they built larger and more ornate buildings. With the increase in trade, scattered homesteads began to give way to warm domestic houses in pleasant towns and villages. Not only did the merchants and growers benefit from all this wealth, but the king also, from the taxes on wool which he imposed to meet his growing needs. The royal household obtained most of its money from these taxes. Taxes on wool paid for armies and wars, and the wealth of many noble families came from trading in wool. By the 15th century, from being a mere household need, wool had become one of the greatest influences in the country. Wool merchants built themselves fine houses. In the wool towns are some of England's loveliest churches. Merchants added chapels covered with rich carvings and decoration. The wool trade had brought great wealth to England, wealth that was to be the foundation of one of her greatest industries. And this is how a poet of the time spoke of it. O wool, noble dame, thou art the goddess of merchants. Thou art cherished throughout the world, and the land where thou art born may do great things by reason of thee. O fair, O white, O delightful one, The love of thee binds so that the hearts of those men who make merchandise of thee cannot escape.